On my previous video about whiteness, blackness, and Cuban-ness, I didn't quite say everything I wanted to say. I probably won't ever say all that I want to say about it, but the particular point that I felt wasn't emphasized quite enough that I want to emphasize is the fact that, for instance, in the case of my white grandma, South Carolina, and my Cuban grandpa, it's not. I think in the previous video, I very much focused on unity, which was important. I needed to focus on that, but I also want to say how it's not like they got married. It's not like they developed their relationship and it just suddenly worked out perfectly. Their two cultures became one. No, there was a lot of, on both sides, on my grandma's side and on my grandpa's side, where they needed to legitimately retain their own culture. They can't. There are certain aspects of your own culture that you can't really let go of, and that's one thing I didn't emphasize in the last video. But there's a way where when different cultures interact, even though they are their own distinct cultures, there's a way they can both retain their culture, but also but also blend into the culture in which you are entering into. So there's, I've recently, it's been about a year now, but I read Joseph Ratzinger's, who the former Pope Benedict XVI, who was the Pope before Pope Francis. I read his book called Truth and Tolerance, and in that book he talks about culture and sort of what a culture is, how cultures interact with each other. I can't do justice to his book, but I mentioned the book to say that he kind of brings up the point that in intercultural dialogue, when cultures meet and sort of blend together, there's a sort of organic process through the universality of human love. There's a way the two cultures are able to overcome their differences and still relate on basic human levels, and even share parts of their culture with the other culture, so that I'll take the example of my grandma and grandpa. Parts of my grandpa's culture were actually shared with my grandma. My grandma inherited a new kind of culture. I think there's something great about that idea. Like, there's something that wasn't a part of her life before she met my grandpa, and through my grandpa's sharing of his culture with her, her culture kind of developed and became organically a kind of new culture. So anyway, I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to really emphasize that two cultures are distinct, but that through the universality of human love, which is able to overcome our differences, I think that's the kind of cultural interaction that we need to focus on. And there's another interesting question that I want to bring up, and it is that, is there any possibility that that there could be something kind of bad in a culture? Is it possible for there to be, I guess, what I would call harmful cultural developments? I think everybody would say yes, that is possible, and this can happen on grand scale levels, or it can happen on very subtle levels, and what I think could be happening between Chris and I is I know he would object to this, but what might be happening is I might be seeing an instance in which part of what he is calling his cultural development, I might be saying that might not be a great part of your culture to include. Because Chris and I are different cultures, different races, right now we are undergoing what I've sort of been talking about, intercultural exchange. We're trying to share kind of the better parts of ourselves with one another while also retaining our own cultures. So I think it would be, to tell the truth, I think it would be a little, I can't think of a good word. It would be, I guess, a little false on Chris's part to claim that white people have absolutely no kind of ability to have a say on what might be a good or bad part of black culture. At the end of the day, black culture is in the possession of black people, and there's a certain intimacy that white people cannot know. But as far as intercultural dialogue and exchange is concerned, I think I can have a legitimate case in saying this whole tendency to sort of talk about white people in the way that Chris is doing it, that might be a part of your culture that might not be very good. That might be a part of your culture that could potentially be modified, still retain that sense of how you can't just forget the fact how the way white Americans have treated black Americans, that can't just be forgotten. But there may be, what I may be touching on is there may be a better way to go about it, and I think that's something legitimate that I think he should have to take seriously. Essentially, what I'm saying, if I may wrap this up, is black people and white people are not infallible. They both make mistakes. They both have parts of their cultures that are imperfect and that need some purifying, need some edification from an outside source. So there's, just as I would say that, as a white person, I think black people have the full right to criticize many aspects, well, really any aspect of white culture that infringes on common justice, common virtue. Black people have a full right to criticize white people and to recommend and even fight for changes in white culture. But I would say that the argument also applies to, I think white people should be allowed to sometimes recommend changes to black culture whenever we recognize that there might be something harmful developing within it. And I think as Chris and I continue to discuss and dialogue, maybe that is part of what we will come to recognize. Maybe I am recognizing something legitimate that might need to be redirected in a sense. What is the best way for black people to express their current situation with the injustice of how they're being treated by white people? What are the legitimate ways that black culture can express that and unite over that? because right now I think his current method isn't the best kind of method. It tends to lead to more what I might call bitterness, more rivalry, rather than it does trying to lead to. There's a certain way in which you can express your hatred of injustice in a way that is kind of pure. And you always want to fight for that kind of purity of expression. And I think I can help Chris, as well as other Black Americans, to tend toward that purity of expression. So that's all I had to share.